While differentiating the steps that goes into making a sculpture isn't perhaps as straightforward an affair as we would like to make it seem, we are here smack in the middle of what I would refer to as the modeling stage. And for me, this usually means two things, with a third coming as a byproduct. Even that's not entirely the truth, of course, because there is back and forth here as well, but let's simplify first, and then we'll add more complexity to it later. So the two things that I'm doing in the modeling stage are addition of clay to the forms themselves, which means adding volume, helping the form turn, which just means making things feel a bit rounder and not flat. Not simply spherical, of course, but rounder in whatever way a form needs to be rounder. The other is transitional work, which means adding clay into the transitions to soften them and make it seem like a layer of skin is draped across the sculpture's surface, and that we're not looking at somebody that's been flayed or something like that. The byproduct of doing these two things is that the surface gets smoother. So simply by modeling, we begin to approach the final surface that we are after. I prefer it this way since it means we're not stuck with a step that's purely surface work. We're never really polishing our sculpture. The finish comes as a byproduct of the process it took to make it. While not that important perhaps, I do prefer this as the work is mostly about making the sculpture better, not about making the sculpture prettier. What is discovered during this process is of course shape design that's less than ideal, for example, and at that point you have to go back in and redesign a bit. Which isn't such a bad thing and something I expect to happen. Since I know it's part of the process, I don't get too down about having to reverse course and go backwards from time to time. It's just the nature of the beast. The ears at this moment is sort of a microcosm of the entire process compressed into one little region. The ears being very high in detail and placed at the edge or the outline of the head from the front view usually gets left for rather late in the process of the sculpture. As you've seen in the videos, I tend to let them be these very simple shapes to begin with. This simple shape without any details inside has the broader considerations taking into account, the things that will eventually make it look like an ear. And these considerations are things like placement from the front and from the side, the overall proportion of the ear in relation to everything else around it, the gesture of the ear, if you will, the fact that it is not sitting vertically but sort of leans back a bit on the head. These are the most important elements to get right, of course, but at an early point, before any real effort has been made to make this look like a proper ear, or a complex ear, let's say, these considerations have been made, but I understand and know that these are approximations at this point, and I'm certain that I have plenty of flaws built into my ears. This is okay and not something I concern myself with. And to be frank with you, I never concern myself too much with mistakes in the beginning, since it's borderline impossible for me to get these broad considerations right anyways. The important thing is to make sure that in this early stage of anything that is that nothing you do becomes a hindrance later on. So perhaps the ear needs to have its proportion altered. Well, then the question should be how much. And as long as I am close enough in the beginning that the changes needing to take place later don't become difficult to make, as long as that has taken place, I'm fine. If you're working from reference and accuracy is of a great concern, the same approach should be taken. A process that allows for refinement and iterations over time is likely to be a successful process, and a successful process leads to a successful end result. Accuracy of any kind, anyways, is a cumulative thing, a cumulative process that needs to take place over a prolonged period of time. It's not something that is achieved. Accuracy isn't achieved in the first few moments of a sculpture. It's built and adjusted for over time, and that's sort of the mindset that I go into this with. With a mindset like that, and a process that aligns with that mindset, I think it makes it easier to make good sculpture. From a process perspective, the ears are rather straightforward. Once position, proportion, and gesture has been solved, I move on to the internals of the ears. Here, as always, I'll start with drawing, and once I have exhausted my ability to draw, I will begin to add clay. To make a good ear, it can be useful to have reference, but you'll quickly learn the construction and anatomy of the ear, as it is rather simple and doesn't move a lot, obviously. And then you'll be able to make ears in your sleep. The ear looks really intimidating and complex to begin with, and it certainly is, but its building blocks are rather simple, and because it doesn't move, there's not a lot of variety taking place. There is, however, great variation in different people's ears, and they're rather organic in shape, so there's plenty of wiggle room as well when it comes to working purely from imagination. You can come up with a lot of different versions of ears, and they will look very plausible if the major building blocks and the anatomy has been considered. While lots of names can be thrown around when talking about ear anatomy, I do suggest you just take a look in your anatomy book or Google ear anatomy, as there is a lot of free reference and more than good enough as well resources to be found doing so. Pretty standard procedures like working from big to small works really well when it comes to the ears. Working big to small here simply means starting with the outline, draw the bigger shapes that sit inside, remove the clay from the ear hole and carve in the creases between the major forms. From here it's going to be a lot of finicky work and some detail work, and having reference of specific ears can really help you out if you're new to this. And it can also help you out making ears that seem a bit more organic, and perhaps making ears that have some more idiosyncrasies that you wouldn't be able to come up with yourself. Because as I said, there is a vast variety in the kind of ears that you'll find in nature. A common issue I find with people's ears, or people's sculpted ears rather, is a lack of volume, and that means that the ear looks thin, like it's made out of paper. This issue comes from something that's actually a problem in more places than ears. But since ears, even in life size, are very small, very detailed, the issue often becomes extra pronounced here. And the problem is turning small forms or adding volume to smaller forms, making smaller forms seem round. Adding volume to a form simply means making it feel rounder. There are boundaries to forms. Usually a form is broad, and there's the space between these boundaries, and therefore the space between these boundaries is broad as well. This makes adding volume to forms like this easier, and something that most of us, even beginners, are going to be capable of doing. In smaller areas, however, the boundaries to the forms are very close together, which makes the space where the volume ought to be added or needs to be added in order to not change the shape of the form itself. It makes that area very small and sometimes a little bit hard to reach or to see and understand. While controlling the clay and having a delicate hand is not something that is needed to make good sculpture in my opinion, it is often needed if we are attempting to reach a certain level of resolution. The solution to this problem, the thin ear problem if you will, seems a bit simple perhaps, and perhaps a bit unfair. Number one is to practice and get a better control of your material. And that's gonna be something that comes with time and simply spending more time doing something than you think you need to. If you think it should take you 10 seconds to place the clay down and add it to the ear, spend 20 seconds and you'll see a massive difference in what you're capable of doing. Number two is knowing that the issue exists to begin with, and therefore we can attack it properly. When it comes to feedback and teaching students, I find that most of the time it's not so much about teaching them or telling them what to do, but directing them on what to focus on and then letting them figure out the how themselves. Certainly with some information sprinkled in, of course, some theory if you will, but once you make someone aware of a problem in their work or their technique, most people seem to be capable of dealing with that issue. Other places where the issue of small forms having a hard time turning tend to pop up are around the eyes and around the mouth. Especially in the philtrum and the edges of the lips, where the color meets the skin, we see these issues. These edges and ridges that exists here have a tendency to become very sharp and sudden, often betraying the effect of a soft and fleshy face and a mouth that is not robotic. While not a simple thing to achieve by any stretch of the imagination, keep in mind that most forms on the face and the body in general are going to turn very softly with very few hard edges and ridges. I will say that I think it's better to make a form somewhat broader than it needs to be in order for it to turn properly. So if you do struggle with clay control and perhaps a bit of a heavy hand, keep this in mind and use it to your own advantage. I'd rather see a sculpture with forms that are a bit too broad but still soft, as compared to a sculpture with forms that are way too sharp, as this completely betrays any illusion of organic life. If something does seem sharp, which it does when the high point of the form is like the peak of a steep mountain, don't take down the peak of the mountain. Work on either side of the peak and add clay. If it makes the form slightly broader than you'd like it to, you can settle for that in many scenarios, and keep in mind that broader and softer forms are better than narrow and sharper ones anyways.